Hi, I'm Zahar, and welcome back to the Weekly Point with Z. Now, this is episode 3 of a limited series on the socioeconomics of Lebanon, and in this episode, we're going to be building on concepts or ideas that were discussed in the previous few weeks, and that would allow us to kind of understand the current crisis that Lebanon is currently in and lay the groundwork for next week when we discuss potential solutions for this crisis. Now, without further ado, to jump right into it, I'd like to go back to one of the main points or main themes that we've discussed in the episode on the timeline of crises in Lebanon. I would like to go back in history a few years to the end of the civil war around the late 90s and the reign of the late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, who was assassinated a few years later in 2005. But to go back to that period and discuss some of the decisions that were made by his government and the political establishment back then, which kind of laid the foundations to the current crisis, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I have no doubt that his intentions were, his heart was in the right place. It's just the implementation of it all was not necessarily correct, or at least it did not lead to the positive outcome that he was hoping it would lead to. Now, if we go back to that period, we have the end of the Civil War, we have the Taif Accords. Taif is a city in Saudi Arabia where the accords were signed to end the Lebanese Civil War and distribute power between the different competing factions within the country. If we go back to that time, we got Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, who was relatively unknown back then, moving into Lebanon and ascending to the role of Prime Minister. It was a time where there was this agreement on a shared sphere of influence between Syria on one hand, which sees Lebanon as a part of Greater Syria. So historically, Lebanon was part of the Greater Syria region, and the Syrian regime tends to still see it that way. They're not ready to accept that Lebanon is an independent state. And you got, on the other hand, Saudi, which has legitimate interests in Lebanon to some extent. At least in terms of that natural extension of the Saudi sphere of influence through the Lebanese Sunni Muslim community. Now, Prime Minister Hariri ascended to the role of Prime Minister. He was relatively unknown back then, and he found himself in a situation where the country was devastated by a very long civil war. Everything was collapsing. There was no formal state, and the civil war took approximately around 17 years. I believe it went on for 17 years, and nothing was functioning as it is. Like there was no good starting point to resume proper functioning of the state. So what he did is he resorted to what most nations in that situation resort to, and he started borrowing massively from international creditors. There was this will to help Lebanon reconstruct itself, and PM Hariri kind of oversaw or facilitated that process, and he started borrowing massively from international creditors and internal ones as well. And when he started borrowing all of that money, he poured in that money into investments within the country. He invested heavily in repropping or reconstructing Lebanese infrastructure, utility services. He invested massively as well in infrastructure projects, in healthcare and education, in different economic sectors, but mainly tourism and banking as well. So he started propping up all of these economic sectors in the hopes of reconstructing the country and generating economic output, renewed economic output, in order for the country to sustain itself and progress forward. Now, his intentions, as I mentioned, were good. It was the only solution he could resort to. There was no other solution back then. But as often is the case, the devil is in the details. It's in the implementation of it all. Now, what Prime Minister Hariri did is create different problems in his own right. So he was trying to solve a problem, but he created other problems along the way. The first problem is that the country became much more reliant on foreign aid, on tourism, and on borrowing money from whether international creditors or internal banks. The appetite of the government to borrow money kept on increasing, while at the same time there was no proper reform of tax collection or revenue generation for the state. This was a time where there was massive corruption. You got the Syrian army that was stationed in Lebanon and that controlled almost every aspect of life within the country. And then you got this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Syria not to stir the water. So there was this tolerance for corruption. There was this tolerance for the extent of the corruption imposed by the Syrian military presence. And Prime Minister Hariri was trying to mitigate conflict and kind of manage this corruption in a way whereby he doesn't offset the Syrian regime and prompting further action, but at the same time kind of trying to manage a country that is barely trying to hold it together and just reconstruct itself. So there was this massive borrowing to invest, but there's not enough effort, or at least not as much effort, to properly reform tax collection and other forms of revenue generation. Now, what happened is the government had an insatiable appetite for borrowing money. The country on the surface seemed like it was booming, and it truly was. Like there was immense economic growth, around 5 to 7%. Things were improving massively. Utilities were back. Services were back. The country was seeing around 2 million tourists a year. There was a general sense that everything was going great. The country's back on its feet. Everything is going great. And along that and along all of this financial engineering of this economic revival, there was also reform in other directions and on other topics and on other economic sectors, whereby education improved, cultural output improved. Lebanon became the beacon of Arab culture in the Middle East. There was massive investments in the education sector, whether vocational education or university education, higher education. There was a massive influx of students from all across the Arab world because it became a hub for university studies in the region. And there was this massive ease or comfort around where things were progressing or the direction that the country was moving towards. But under the surface, there, as I mentioned, there was this insatiable appetite by the government to borrow. It was met halfway by an insatiable appetite by Lebanese banks to lend the government, because they saw they were generating massive profits out of this. They saw a lot of potential in lending the government and at a high interest rate, because obviously Lebanon is not one of the most credit-worthy states. So it borrows money at a high interest rate, and the banks in Lebanon saw a great opportunity to benefit from that. Especially that the government was working to maintain great relationships with wealthy Arab states, especially in the Gulf region. And you got this massive influx of investments from those countries or from investors in those countries, which kind of got us in a cycle where you got an influx of cash into Lebanese banks, which lent the money to the Lebanese government, which improved services, infrastructure, and invested in tourism and other sectors, which lured in more Arab tourists, which lured in turn, more Arab investors, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with that is the banks started promising unrealistic high interest rates to keep luring in those Arab investors. They had an influx of cash that they kept on using to lend money to the state. And at the same time, you got the state trying to stabilize this entire economic cycle by virtually propping up the Lebanese currency, which was unrealistic. So they pegged the Lebanese currency to the dollar, and they started kind of propping up the Lebanese currency to keep it at a certain rate that is pegged to the dollar, which required massive careful engineering by the Central Bank of Lebanon, which added to the pressures on the economy. And at the same time, you got this situation where the country imports 90% of all of its needs because it's a tiny place in terms of geography and economic output. So you got this situation where you got, again, a massive influx of cash from Arab investors that was being invested in banks and in different projects around the country, that was being lent to the government. And then you got a negative balance of trade. Then you got inefficient collection systems. So you got money coming in, but a lot of money coming out as well, or being lost within the cycle. Then 2005 comes along and Prime Minister Hariri is assassinated, God rest his soul. And all of a sudden, you got this massively destabilizing event, and you got the different factions within the country automatically resorting to entrenching themselves into opposing camps. On one end, you got Hezbollah and Amal, which are mainly Shia Muslim-dominated groups. And then you got the rest of the country on one end, which is shocked by what happened, and at the same time automatically pointing the finger to Syria as a culprit in the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, especially that his relationship with Syria was really sour, had gone really sour in the 2 years prior to his assassination, and he was provoking the Syrians too much, so to speak, if we want to simplify it that way. And rightfully so, the International Tribunal for the Assassination of Prime Minister Hariri did find links to Syria, but not only Syria. It was Syria and Iran who orchestrated the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri. But anyway, that came in years later. So you got these two groups who were entrenched, and then you got massive pressure in the streets. You got a vacuum of power. You got a lot of anger. You got a lot of instability. And you've got this massive pressure on the streets against Syria and demanding the retrieval or the retreat of the Syrian army from Lebanon. And that's exactly what happened a few months later. And the Syrians retreated, which created more of a vacuum of power. And now you got different players vying for control. The Syrian army left out, and then it was a lot of infighting at that moment. And then to add salt to injury, you got a Christian political leader, Michel Aoun, who's the current president of Lebanon, so President Aoun back then, who was leading the Aoun faction or political party, which is called now the Tayyar movement. And then there was this internal clash between the different opposition groups, and then President Aoun, who was back then a political leader, moved into the camp of Hezbollah and Amal, and he started this long journey of rapprochement with the Syrian regime, and he moved from being a rival of Syria into an ally of Syria, and he started defending Hezbollah's policies in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. Now, what this led us to is a massive crisis in the country where everything was paralyzed. There's not a single decision that is a sound strategic, political, or economic decision that was made back then. It was all about the infighting between the two different entrenched groups, each vying for power, and it paralyzed the country. There was an utter neglect of the economy. There was an utter neglect of the infrastructure, of utilities, of services. The government started losing control. There was a collapse of government institutions in their formal sense. And the influence of the government started receding, and the influence of Hezbollah started increasing. Now, all of this was happening around the time where you got different very important external factors happening. You got the war in Iraq, which destabilized Iraq and opened up the doors or the western gateway of Iran, which allowed it to expand its influence massively in the region. It gave Iran a free hand in the region and allowed them to expand westwards. And this gave Hezbollah, by extension, a lot of power and control over Lebanon. You got the financial crisis of 2008. You got massive inflation. You got the energy crisis that kept appearing every few years. And then you got the Arab Spring and the focus of Arab leaders on internal issues within their countries. They were trying to stabilize situations within their countries and kind of secure their rule. So there was this deprioritizing of the issues of Lebanon and reshifting in focus to internal issues within each Arab country, which again deprived Lebanon of the main source or influx of cash that it used to enjoy, or at least the attention that it used to get from A, Arab tourists, and B, Arab investors. And then you got the war in Syria, which made things infinitely worse because if you know anything about Lebanon and Syria are very closely connected. Historically, they were always part of wider nations, so there's this intermingling of the two populations of the two countries. Families are split across borders. There's this major cultural and economic and political and social connection between the two. So you got the faction that is anti-Syrian in Lebanon automatically aligning itself to the Syrian opposition, and you got Hezbollah in Amal and the faction that is pro-Iran in Syria in Lebanon automatically aligning itself to the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And Lebanon got sucked into that conflict. And although the impact in terms of infighting between these different factions was limited, sort of, the economic impact was massive. Again, Lebanon is bound by geography. To the north and to the east, it's bordered by Syria, and to the south, it's bordered by Israel. And obviously, Lebanon is at war with Israel as well. So you got this confinement of Lebanon. You got this frame where everything around you was going wrong, and you have no outlet. You have no way of reaching out to the outside world beyond your borders. And imports got impacted, exports got impacted, the currency got impacted because you got this massive leaking of foreign reserves, with the government pumping up a lot of cash and a lot of foreign currency into the market to stabilize the currency, the local currency, and at the same time, much of that money or that foreign currency going into Syria to be traded on the black market in the Syrian economy. So you got this massive leakage and massive pressure on the central bank to pump up even more foreign currency, which goes into Syria. And then add to that the fact that there were many sanctions imposed on Syria. So Syria started relying on the black market even more, with a lot of the resources in Lebanon going to Syria, including resources subsidized by the Lebanese state to kind of soften the impact of inflation on foreign imports and the impact on the local economy from all of these crises around the country. And then on top of all of that, you got the frequent wars and skirmishes with Israel, which kind of devastated the country time and time again. And when you combine these external and internal factors, you got a recipe for disaster. You got the perfect combination of everything that could go wrong. And then you're left with a situation where you got a crumbling economy. You got a decline in economic output. You got a dry up of investments. You got collapsing infrastructure and utilities. You got a collapse of government rule and services. You got a negative balance of trade. You got inflation. You got a loss of purchasing power because your currency is collapsing. And then you got a loss of liquidity. You're no longer able to prop up that currency. And then all of your foreign reserves being dried up again as well, and loss of liquidity, and you're left in a situation where everything you own is now worthless or neglected. Everything you used to buy is much more expensive. Your ability to buy is diminished. You can't afford to buy anything else, and you can't afford to keep what you have. Now, on top of all of that, there was this decision by Lebanese banks back then, when they were inciting Arab investment, to guarantee the savings or the cash or the money or the capital of Arab investors and certain Lebanese leaders in power who are in power, and to neglect the savings of the local population. So when you got this drying up of liquidity, most of what remained went to guarantee the savings of Arab investors or the money of Arab investors, the savings of corrupt regime officials, which was by some form of a miracle transferred outside of the country right before the crisis hit. And then you got what's left, which was supposed to cover the local population, the savings of the local population, but is not enough at all to cover any of it. So all of these crises, and you got the perfect storm brewing in the horizon, and then all of a sudden it hits you. And what's surprising about it is that all of the signs were there, but everyone failed to see it. It's not because of a lack of understanding. It's just a lack of information. And this goes back to what we discussed in the previous episode. There's a willful ignorance in Lebanon not to look at data. The local population is so uneducated on data and on economics and on statistics that they fail to see that storm that is brewing in the horizon, because they have no access to information and they have no desire to access information or to analyze information. So the signs were there, and there were a lot of warning signs that came up along that journey. And those lights, those warning signs kept on coming up throughout the previous few years ahead of that crisis. But no one would listen, which goes back to the point that we discussed last week as well. Those who did listen did not care beyond the confines of their religious group, community or faction that they belong to. So even if though they saw signs that would impact the entire economy, as long as the leader that they follow, that they idealize in this personality cult culture that we have, was promising him that everything is going to go fine, they did not bother worry about it. They did not bother prepare for it. And this is the odd part out of all of this. All of these factors, all of these ingredients would generate this type of crisis. This is not a shock. The shocking part is the signs were there and no one was prepared for it. And no one was trying to mitigate it. No one was even trying to mitigate it. You got the different camps fighting over power and not doing anything about this beast coming in their way, which they've noticed with the back of their eye, but decided to completely ignore. Now, I hope this gives you a brief understanding of the crisis. Obviously, it's much more complex than could be simplified in a short episode or video like this. Please interact with me if you have any questions or if you would like to discuss any of these points in greater detail. But in general, these are the common themes or events or incidents that led to the current crisis, or at least contributed to it. And this is where we find ourselves today. Now, please tune in for next week's episode, where we're going to start to discuss some of the possible solutions to get out of this crisis. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.